Chapter 8. When It All Burns Down. Caden. The Trigger. "The bridge is almost done," Alira commented, looking out over the battlements. "You almost sound disappointed," I commented from her left. "That's not like you at all." "Oh?" she asked, turning to face me. "Starting to remember more, are we?" she pleaded, with hope in her voice. "No." I shot back a bit more gruffly than I'd intended. She looked hurt for only a second before turning away. "Just an observation," I finished. We stood atop the tallest part of the battlements, observing everything below. The rain was falling harder these days, pelting against our clothing with the weight and impact of large pebbles. What remained of the guard was training. What remained of the guard civilians in the arts of archery, among other things. Well, those that would volunteer anyway. A good portion of them had chosen the path of hiding behind the walls, hoping that it would all just go away. Desperation was making people quick learners, especially with the Alathian forces overseeing the operation. Aline was nowhere to be found below. Her time had been better spent cleaning up the fallout from her coup and earning the trust of the citizenry. Not an easy task when martial law was the new name of the game. 2 days, I commented wryly, leaning against the wall beside me. "At the very most." "We won't be ready in 2 days," she responded, looking up into the sky. "It wouldn't matter anyway," I said with a smile that was completely out of place. "My failed expedition was the only way we could have gotten the manpower we needed." "How many men do we have?" she breathed the question, knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "The last engagement wasn't too kind to us," I answered, pushing past her to lean over the battlements again. "And?" she asked, not even turning to face me this time. "By our 10th last report, 20 Alathians, including you, me, and Aline. We have 30 guards that can hold a sword, and all of 48 archers. The civvies add another 50 or so, but they're going to be damned useless when push comes to shove." "So, roughly 120 against..." She gestured to the sea of corpses across the chasm. "That's the gist of it," I responded. "What of all the recruiting you've been doing in the forest?" she said with a hint of desperation. "All of the villages we passed on our last journey were ash. Anyone else remaining probably considers themselves too smart to fight on the losing side." "So we're alone?" she answered with utter finality, leaning on the battlement to my right. "Yes," I answered, though my response wasn't needed. "What about me?" she asked softly, barely shifting to look at me. "Am I alone?" I didn't answer immediately, and for a moment we could hear everything. We heard the falling rain on the stone around us and the rolling thunder in the distance. The voices of the training sergeants echoed below. We could even hear the chopping of wood in the far distance as creatures worked tirelessly on their makeshift bridge. I lifted myself from the battlement slowly and wordlessly made my way to the door that would lead me back inside. Her gaze didn't follow me. I started, causing her to turn towards me. Her hood was down, and her dark blonde hair was made even darker by the wetness of the rain. Her soaked clothes clung to her form, but she didn't show the slightest hint of being cold. Glowing lines of water streamed down her face, passing her glowing crystal blue eyes, down her lips and then off the bottom of her chin. Something sorrowful hid in those cobalt eyes, but she was not keen to show it. "I'm sorry, Caden," she said, stepping towards me. She hesitated this time as she reached me, standing centimeters away. She looked to the ground for a few seconds before meeting my gaze. "I killed her. I'm sorry." She attempted to brush past me through the still open door, apparently done talking. But I grabbed her wrist as she fled, turning her towards me. "You'll never be alone, Alira," I said as she looked up at me, at the mention of her name. "I'm not upset with you," I whispered. "I'm upset because she's dead, and the only one I have to blame is..." "The one who pulled the trigger," she answered back, looking away. I didn't know the word, but I pieced together the meaning. "I just need time," I answered back, looking down at the stone steps. I felt the warmth of her hand against my right cheek, and I leaned into it. "Time is the one thing we don't have," she whispered. "In 5 days, we'll probably be all dead. I want to spend the rest of my life, however short of a time that may be, Will someone I love? I turned my head to the right, placing one hand beneath her right hand as I kissed her palm softly. It's gonna be a cold night, I answered in a hushed tone. I hate to spend it alone. Bring an extra blanket, she answered, running her hand down my face and neck, resting it on top of my chest for only a moment before pulling away and escaping down the stairs. I was still angry, but I figured I'd channel it to the right place. I was going to need Fierce's help. Chapter 8 continued. Aline. Potatoes. Aline strode into the castle's only excuse for a bar. It was mostly empty, considering the early hour. Fierce, however, sat rather comfortably, though a bit sideways on one of the stools. Another? He asked the bartender, who was surprisingly not annoyed at his patron, but rather excited to have anyone to actually charge for something. War tended to have a negative effect on his kind of business. Dead people didn't drink. Corporal? Aline purred, sliding in next to him. His demeanor changed instantly as he straightened up and looked much more sober. I guess no one is really on leave, with the enemies at the gates, he replied without looking over to her, slurring his words gently. No, I suppose not. You here to ask me a question? Fierce stated. It was not a question. Oh? Aline asked, raising an eyebrow to the comment. Am I? You are precise, he began. With you, every small action is deliberate, down to the last calculable variable. He stopped for a moment to take a drink from his newly arrived cup. Well, more specifically, Caden got back too soon. Had we been on time, Caden wouldn't have been around for the coup, and would have gotten back just in time to whisper some words of comfort and guidance to who would have been our new malleable leader. But is now the dead daughter of a slain lord. And, Alira asked luringly, well, something went terribly awry, and you don't like it when things go awry. So? Aline asked, continuing to lead him on. So you want to know what happened out there, in the woods? Precisely, Aline said as she leaned forward, smiling mischievously, and you're just the man to tell me all about it. She whispered as Fierce took a calming breath. Potatoes? Fierce said, sounding haunted, whilst looking to Aline wide-eyed. I shit you not. Potatoes. Everywhere. Chapter 8 continued. Caden. A message. Why do I get the feeling I'm not going to like the reason you're here? Bridget asked with crossed arms as I entered her room. Because you're probably not, I responded almost to myself as I surveyed the area. You, sir. She paused, seeming to look for the right words. Are nothing if not uplifting and cheerful. I raised an eyebrow at her blatant sarcasm, but said nothing in retort. I need you to tell him something for me, I said, locking eyes with her as humor fled her face. Yeah, just let me hop the chasm, waltz past his army, and ask him if he'd like to have a conversation over tea and crumpets. She spat back angrily. I'd have thought that almost dying fighting beside you in the woods would have given me a little slack in the suspicion of treachery department, but I guess not, she said, turning from me and walking briskly to her bed, pausing upon her arrival as though she didn't quite know what to do with herself. I know he comes to you in your dreams, I answered back in careful monotone. 2 days from now, his armies will come, and, well, he's gonna want to talk to you before then. She was quiet for a long moment before she whispered back in a voice that was barely audible. I know, she shivered visibly. I wish I could tell you that you're wrong, but you aren't. I know, and I'm sorry, I replied with more sincerity than I'd thought myself capable of being. What's your damn message? She asked with the slightest hint of hostility still hiding in her voice. Tell him that there's only one thing I want from him, I stated firmly, and I'll be coming to collect it. What is it you want? Bridget asked, confused as I turned for the door that was close behind me. Her question stopped me for a moment, though. His head, I said, unable to resist the barest of smiles that played on my lips. You can't be serious, she exclaimed, grabbing my right shoulder as I went to turn again. The final battle is on the damn horizon, and the men will not hold without you. They won't hold with me either, I shot back, pulling from her grip. This is the only chance we have. And what does Aline think? Bridget almost shouted. She was grasping at straws now. Aline won't be bothered with this, I responded, completely dodging the question and giving an order instead. Bridget threw her hands up, exasperated, as she walked back towards her bed. I continued to leave before pausing in the frame of her door. And Bridget, I called back as she turned towards me expectantly. Stay away from the main gate. With that, I left, closing the door gently behind me. Chapter 8 continued. Days earlier. The Jacobin and fears. Believe anything. Valiant warriors, sir, Glockenstein observed from his place on the Jacobin's shoulder. They fight with honor. That they do, the Jacobin answered, rubbing the peach fuzz on his upper lip and chin. They will not last, though, Glockenstein said expectantly. Not without help. Are you suggesting something? The Jacobin asked, cocking an eyebrow. That's why we're here, sir, the potato stated hesitantly, to make sure everything goes as it must. Indeed, the Jacobin said, nodding sagely, and looking to his potatoes that surrounded him, spears at the ready. Are we ready, men? Jacobin asked with an air of regality. Yes, sir, they echoed back, Glockenstein's voice ringing louder than the rest. To battle, sir? Glockenstein asked, raising his spear. To battle, my friend, Jacob answered with a smile. This isn't going well, Fears commented from his place on the ground covered in mud. The Elathian man fell to the ground to Fear's right as he slid from Caden's sword. Are you kidding? Caden shouted as the man tackled him to the ground from behind. Caden wrestled his way on top of the man before driving his fist into the man's nose several times with bone-crushing force. I thought we were doing well, he yelled over the din of the fighting. I wouldn't say that, Bridget screamed as an Anaran man threw her into a tree, knocking the breath from her as she fell into the mud face first. Fears had finally gotten to his feet, but quickly found himself being backed up by two men swinging small knives. At least they want us alive, Caden shouted, tripping a man and slamming his head into the ground with a sickening crack. Speak for your goddamn self, Fears responded, catching a knife-wielding man by the wrist and elbow, twisting and stepping forward in a fashion that, for all intents and purposes, snapped the man's arm in half. The man screamed, dropping the knife which Fears expertly caught. Both Fears and Caden turned suddenly to the sound of both Bridget's screaming as a knife was plunged into her thigh. Then, suddenly, battle cries echoed from the forest. Potatoes charged out of the brush and fell from the trees, wielding cruel-looking spears and expressions that warmed of dark intent. Anarans fell left and right as the three Elathians stood with their mouths gaping. Caden seemed slightly less stunned than the other two as he whispered, "Not this again," to himself, still visibly shaken. The Jacobin followed the charge of the potatoes shortly after with the first few kills, wielding a hammer that appeared far too large for his small frame. He swung it with ease, however, as it came into contact with his foes. They screamed and burst into flames before turning into rainbow-colored feathers that gently floated up, rather than down. The battle was won swiftly, as the potatoes far outnumbered their Anaran opponents. The beleaguered Elathians drew back, leaning on trees, their exhaustion apparent, save for Caden, who stood to meet the Jacobin. Covered in blood, only half of it his own, mud, and sweat, he swayed slightly as Jacob approached, Glockenstein taking his customary place on Jacob's shoulder. Why? Caden asked, wiping sweat from his brow with his mud-soaked sleeve. Because everything must happen as it should, the Jacobin responded with a smile that said, Don't you know this already? What does that mean? Caden asked, switching to a more important question. Who the hell are you? Some would call me Harold, Jacob responded, standing tall and proud. And all I'm telling you is that whatever should happen, will happen. You know how this is going to end? Caden asked incredulously. No, Jacob said, jumping back a few steps. I know how this should end. But Harold, you said... Not Harold, the Jacobin hissed. Harold! He screwed up his face in apparent disgust. Who would name their child Harold? He paused, cocking his head to the side. Harold. he said to himself, testing out the word, and apparently not liking the taste it left in his mouth. Harold, he whispered one more time, making another face. Shh, Glockenstein interjected pointedly. Sir, do you? Yes, the Jacob whispered almost reverently. The broccoli are coming. The time draws near. Jacob's eyes took on a distant cast before focusing back on Caden. Goodbye, then, he said with a smile as everything around the Alathians began to blur. I must go, Jacob said as he floated into the sky in a bright light. My people need me, he said in a deep, thundering voice as the forest faded away. There was a flash of bright light, followed by a suffocating darkness before the three opened their eyes. They stood, relatively unscathed, at the main entrance of the castle. What the? Fears began. Fuck. Bridget finished his question as Caden did a quick turn to get his bearings back. Later, Caden said firmly. Throne room. Now, he ordered as he started running towards the entrance. They obeyed quickly and without hesitation, though Fears and Caden quickly outpaced Bridget due to her newer injury. They hit the stairs hard as they began to take in what they looked like. Somehow, the rips and stains were gone from their uniforms. Fears's had been completely replaced. The injuries remained, however, and new stains were appearing in places that hid deeper cuts. It was not time for reflection, though. Right then, it was the time to run, and quickly. Present day. Now you can threaten me with whatever you like, Fears slurred slightly, but the story won't change, and if Caden is half the man I know he is, then he'll back me up on this. Well, in point of fact, Aline said, stealing the newly arrived cup to take a sip of her own, you're actually backing up his story. He had left quite a report in my quarters. Now I trust him and all, but this warranted a secondary source. Wait, Fears said with a bewildered expression. You believe me? Corporal, Aline responded with a far-off gaze. You live long enough and you see a lot of strange things. Eventually, you'll believe anything. Chapter 8. Continued. Caden. Remembering. He'll kill you? She whispered softly as I ran my left hand down her arm from shoulder to fingertips. She lay on her side with her back to me, the sheets only covering her lower legs. The night was cold, but her smooth skin held the barest warmth as I returned my hand to her upper back, drawing invisible lines absently. Your confidence in me is really reassuring, I whispered back, in response kissing her neck softly. She twisted around further, messing up the already tangled sheets, facing me with her brilliant blue eyes. She placed her right index finger on my lips, shushing me. You could beat anyone with enough effort, she whispered, pulling me into a long kiss before backing up the shortest distance and speaking again, this time in a hushed tone. But the wolf? It's not someone. He's something. I know, I said, pulling her on top of me, feeling her body intertwine with mine. Then don't go, she pleaded sharply, digging the nails of her right hand into my chest. The pain was negligible. She ran the back of her left hand down my cheek, and I grabbed her hand, gently, kissing it softly before speaking. I have to, I answered as she pulled her hand away and slapped me hard enough to sting. No, you don't, she said, resting her hand softly on the place she just slapped. Let someone else be everyone's hero this time, she implored with her eyes. This time? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Shut up, she said urgently. It's not important now, she breathed, staring into my soul through my eyes. Stay with me, Kate. Don't go out there, she said, jarring me with the rare use of my nickname. Lyra, You won't come back, Caden, she shouted, a single tear finally escaping. Stay with me, please. This time, just this once. Be my hero. In that moment, Alira's watery blue eyes staring into mine, her body pressed against mine, her cold hand resting gently on my stinging cheek. I remembered another woman who'd recently asked much the same of me, and in that moment, my decision was made. I'll stay, I comforted, reaching my right hand up to brush a tear away with my thumb before running my fingers through her hair. She kissed me softly, and I turned us onto our sides again, before she released. I promise. She smiled in response before cuddling closer. "It's cold," she explained under her breath. "But you like the cold," I responded, holding her close. "Starting to remember, are we?" She asked the question again with the same hope as before. "Yes," I whispered back, burying my face in her hair, savoring her warmth and the scent of her hair. "Yes, I am." The building. Take the building, I thought to myself as I stared over a pile of rubble. Artillery fire sounded in the distance, interrupting the calm of the otherwise quiet night. I couldn't remember why we had to take A sharp pain exploded through my skull, racking my mind and sending me reeling. A bomb, I remembered as the pain subsided. We had to disarm the bomb? Yes, that was it. Disarm the bomb because that building was important somehow. The why didn't really matter. I knew my objective, so it was high time I got it done. Suddenly, it was as if I was no longer in control of my own body. I felt more like I was watching the show from inside my own skin. I watched as I turned and looked down at the 30 or so men and women below. Their traditional Alathian colors had been coated with thick layers of dust and powdered mortar, causing them to camouflage more naturally with the surrounding environment. 15 of you are coming with me," I said loud enough for them to hear. "The others start evacuating the civvies just in case the Anarans have something up their sleeve." What I had actually meant was, just in case all 16 of us die before the bomb goes off. But that wasn't something typically that you shared with your men. "I'm coming," a man said to my left. I turned to face the man that carried a large rifle. "Wouldn't be much fun without you, brother," I smiled, recognizing the face underneath the mud and filth. It was Fears, and if Fears was here, then I turned to face those below, and yes, Alira was there as well. Somehow, the situation, combined with the bayoneted rifle she carried, made her all the more stunning. "Alira," I called, "you're leading the evac." Her cobalt eyes flashed with defiance from underneath the mud and soot as she grimaced and took the order in stride, regardless of her feelings on it. "Arkenth," she called as the graying man came forward. "Pick out a few poor saps to help us do the heavy lifting." "Well," he said, pointing to 2 men as he spoke, gesturing them over to Alira. "You know the commander wouldn't be leaving her behind if he wasn't planning on coming back." He laughed as the men followed suit. It was a fallible argument, especially considering the fact that the opposite was true, but lies were a necessary part of command. Arkenth continued to pick out more men as Fears leaned over to have a quieter conversation with me. "How are we getting over there?" he asked, gesturing beyond the wall of rubble. "Recklessly," I answered with a smirk. "Hey now," he replied. "I'm the resident smartass here, sir. All jokes aside, though, I'm assuming the typical cover and strafe?" he asked. "You assume correctly," I answered, letting the smile fade from my features. You don't know how to disarm a bomb?" "Nope. Nobody here does." "Nope. Winging it?" "Yep. Just the way I like it," he said, reaching out his arm. I grasped it firmly as I looked to the 14 Arkenth had left for us. "Cover and strafe?" one of them asked quietly. "Cover and strafe," I nodded, releasing Fears' arm as he peeked over and fired 2 shots. "Go!" he yelled, firing again as we all sprung up, running out onto the sparsely covered plain between us and the building. After what seemed like only a moment's time, I knelt in front of a mostly dismantled bomb. A timer conveniently, if not stressfully, counted down the time to our imminent demise. It wasn't giving us a lot of time. "I don't like that look, sir," Fears breathed as we knelt on either side of the machine. "What look?" I asked, looking up from my work for a second. He said that far too often. "The we're fucked look," he answered back, watching the counter tick back from 20. "There's a look?" I asked almost breathlessly. "Yes, it's the one you're giving me now." We were on the top floor of the building now. The walls were mostly gone, along with most of our ammo. Fears had only a single shot that was already in the chamber. I closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze brush across the sweat on my brows. I fought to open my eyes and continued to try and disarm the damn thing, but my body wouldn't move. That was until I heard a gunshot reporting far too close, ringing in my ears as my eyes shot open. The bomb had a single smoking hole in it, with the timer glitching between the numbers 5 and 4, flashing back and forth repeatedly. Fear stood on the other side of the bomb, smoke filtering from the barrel of his gun. "You," I stuttered, searching for the right words to say, but nothing was coming. Figured if we were going to die anyway, I'd do it on my own time. "But," I shouted, "you shot it!" "Yeah," Fear said, almost sounding confused. "And?" "You shot a bomb," I yelled. "A bomb! You shot it!" I exclaimed, bursting into laughter. Fears joined in, along with the 9 men and women that remained. The moment was shattered by distant gunshots. All were sounding from where we'd just been. I gestured to Fears, who tossed me his now empty rifle. I caught it as I stood, running over to a more crumbled section of the wall. I looked through the scope to find people running from the buildings. One creature ravaged the entire side of town, seeming to be everywhere at once. It killed indiscriminately as it rampaged. I'd never seen the creature before, but it resembled a very large tiger with orange and black fur that seemed all too dark a shade. I tracked it with the scope, unable to do anything. Eventually, I felt my stomach drop as Alira stepped out into the medium-sized square that served as an intersection for 4 of the roads. She squeezed off several rounds at the creature, hitting it center mass, but the creature didn't even react. I squeezed my own trigger as I lined up the shot meant for the head, knowing that the gun wouldn't fire. I heard a faint click, but that was my only reward. "Hey, boss?" Fears called from behind me. I looked away from the scope with apparent hesitation as the creature reached Alira. I turned to find Fears pulling a single bullet from his chest pocket. I thanked God and whatever other deities that had convinced Fears to carry an extra bullet around as I pulled back the slide of the bolt-action rifle. I caught the bullet that Fears had thrown to me with an underhand toss and slid it into the chamber. Fears was by far a better shot than I was, but there wasn't any time for him to both take stock of the situation and line up the shot. I peered through the scope again to find the creature lifting Alira up by her chin as she desperately held onto its forearms in an effort to keep her neck from holding the entire weight of her body. She kicked at it frantically, but the creature held firm, not even reacting to the blows. I took a deep breath, lining up the shot by placing the crosshairs up and to the right of the creature's head to account for both distance and wind speed. I breathed out steadily, letting the trigger slide as I exhaled. The kick finally came as the weapon discharged. I blinked, but quickly refocused on where I had fired. The creature had taken the shot through the head, dropping Alira as it fell to the ground in a crumpled heap. I allowed myself to smile as I trained the scope on Alira, watching her rise. She gave a quick 2-fingered salute in my direction before limping away quickly, barely holding onto her weapon. I lowered the rifle, observing the situation with my naked eye, trying to assess just how badly we'd lost the battle. Considering the fact that the objective was to protect the civvies at all costs, I would have said that we'd succeeded. The territory was just an added bonus. The cost had been high, though. I turned to walk away before noticing the bearish movement out of the corner of my eye. On a hunch, I raised the weapon again, staring down the scopes as the creature, which had impossibly begun to rise to its feet. I knew I was too far away for Alira to hear my shouts from this distance, so I didn't even try. I just watched helplessly as the creature bore down on her. She turned at the last moment, eyes wide, as it jumped to tackle her. I awoke suddenly in a cold sweat, letting out a breath as I sat up that I hadn't meant to be holding. Alira still lay next to me, the air cool around her rather than warm. She stirred only a small amount from my sudden movement. Under most circumstances, I'd have kissed her goodbye, but that was all too likely to wake her, and she wouldn't let me go willingly. Instead, I rose carefully, making my way around the small room to gather my armor. I'd get dressed in Fears' quarters. God knew he wouldn't be using them tonight. I paused at the door, unable to open it as I stared back at her. She rolled onto her back in my absence, and her chest rose and fell in the slightest of movements. I hesitated only one moment longer. This was the only way I could save her. The only way I could save anyone. Chapter 7, continued. Bridget. Scrabble. "Kaden wants you to come," Bridget stated, sauntering towards Fears. "Well, yes," Fears said, taking her entry in stride. "You know, most people would knock." "I'm not most people now, am I?" she responded, shuddering as the words escaped her lips unbidden.
Besides, it is my room.
I suppose so, he laughed. It's not like I'm not happy to see you, he smiled.
Oh, she said, grimacing. Easy with the double negatives there, handsome.
She paused, wrapping her arms around his neck before plastering on an innocent face.
I get confused easily, you know.
She finished, standing on her tiptoes to lay a kiss gently on his lips. The smell of cinnamon wafted on her breath as Fears tried to recover from the kiss.
Apparently, so do I,
he whispered.
So are you going?
She asked, trying to drag him back to reality.
Going where?
He asked, refocusing his eyes.
With Caden, she hinted, to get killed by the wolf.
Yes, he started, but not because he wants me to go.
You want to?
She asked, cocking her head to the side. He's my brother. I have to.
You could convince him not to go at all,
she breathed, resting her head on his chest lightly.
I could,
Fears began, as she pulled her head back sharply, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. But I know he's making the right choice. It has to be done.
Men,
she whispered, shaking her head before returning to her resting position.
Well, if you're perfectly intent on dying,
she said with an exasperated sigh,
perhaps you could give me a night to remember you by.
Of course, Fear said confidently. And what is more memorable than a game of Scrabble? He joked excitedly as she released him and headed towards the door, closing it. Without turning back towards him, she let the shoulders of her heavy cloak drop, revealing her scarred upper back. She let it drop more, as if on accident, letting it slide all the way to the floor, before flipping her hair as she looked over her left shoulder.
Oops,
she whispered. Not Scrabble, then, he muttered to himself as she turned and walked towards him, swaying her hips as she went. She closed the distance as he stared at her form, taking in the beauty of the scars that patterned her body. She pressed her body against his, the warmth of her skin crashing over him like a wildfire. She leaned her hips into him before running the back of her right hand up his bare chest. She ran her index finger down his lips softly before whispering seductively,
No, not Scrabble.
Chapter 8 continued. Caden, crossing the chasm. I just need your help getting in, I whispered quietly as Fears and I navigated the passageway. If you're planning on fighting him, you'll need my help with more than that, Fears answered back with a smile. You'll leave when the fighting starts, Fears. He looked defiant for a moment, and I continued. The men will need someone to lead them. That's what Aline is for, he shot back as we reached and exited the front doors, escaping into the cold, wet air of the courtyard. I grabbed him by the shoulder, stopping him mid-stride and pulling him back. You leave when we find him, I said with as much menace as I could manage. He started before a crisp voice interrupted us both.
You boys really are quite the cliché,
a woman called down from her place on the stairs leading up to the battlements.
Sneaking off in the cover of darkness, arguing about who'll stay and who'll go. Really, I could write a book.
We looked up to find Aline lounging with her back against the wall, her legs outstretched on the stair she was sitting on, as well as the one below. Aline, I began formulating my argument. It's the only...
Oh, shut up, she interrupted. Don't take away my moments. I'm pretty proud of you right now.
So you agree? Fears asked.
If I weren't needed here, I'd be going, Aline answered. Though I wouldn't take the extra baggage, she finished, looking at Fears pointedly.
Mind making us a bridge, then? I asked, knowing how insane I sounded.
That's for you to do, Caden, she smiled. You might doubt your newfound talent, but I do not.
She put in as she hopped down from the stairs, landing with every bit of grace.
Lyra doesn't know, does she?
Aline asked, stopping as she passed me. I shook my head, feeling a wave of shame.
I thought not,
Aline responded, continuing her walk.
I suspect you'd have had to kill her before she'd let you leave.
I looked down at the ground, knowing that her statement was true.
I'll bet Bridget was all too ready to get rid of Fears, though.
She called over her shoulder jokingly. Fears just smiled and shook his head in response. Ready? I asked, looking to Fears. Always, he responded coolly. We walked the distance in silence, anticipation filling the air. After a short while, we reached the chasm. Nothing but darkness extended below, and in the cloud-filled night, we couldn't even see the other side. You've got an idea, I hope? Fears asked nervously. I mean, I have a hell of a long jump, but this is something else entirely. You're not gonna like it, I answered, looking up into the night sky, feeling the rain falling heavily on my face.
You know, Commander, I rarely do like your ideas.
Then why do you stick around?
It's just so much fun, he responded, gripping and re-gripping his bow in his nervousness. I concentrated, taking a deep breath as I closed my eyes. I'd expected that I'd have to learn some fancy martial arts movements, or feel the flow of the water shaped to its actions. But as I stood, I needed only to concentrate and will it to obey me. The sinking feeling took grip of my soul, dropping it and forcing me to exhale sharply. Fears took a steadying breath as I opened my eyes and saw that water had gathered below our feet and turned into icy disks. The ice spread from the middle out in small tendrils that sprouted like cracks and finally formed mostly circular disks beneath us. This would be the hard part, I knew. I wheeled the water forward softly, and we slid off the edge of the cliff. Fears had stopped breathing, and so had I as we glided gently across nothing. At first, the action took almost no effort, but as we reached the middle of the chasm, I felt it beginning to take its toll. I clenched my fists as the discs began to wobble slightly. Fears crouched down, grabbing onto his bow nervously, but said nothing. He may have been nervous, but he had some measure of faith in me. I added a small amount of height to our journey, but the cost was too high for me to continue for any extended amount of time. Fortunately, I didn't need an extended amount of time, as we'd almost reached the other side by now. I closed my eyes, concentrating harder, even sweating in the cold night as the discs shook violently. My ears started ringing, and I barely heard Fear say, "Commander?" in a slightly urgent tone of voice. I held as long as I could, but the pain was unbearable. I cracked beneath the pressure, and the discs shattered, sending us into a tumbling fall. For a moment, I imagined the anticlimactic reality of dying from falling into the damn chasm. But I wasn't given much time to imagine as we crashed into the ground with bone-jarring force. I was aware of myself rolling and tumbling through the long grass and soaked earth, and I heard Fears crashing through the ground close behind. Luckily, we hadn't had much forward momentum, so the tumble ended with us rather gracelessly rolling onto our stomachs and riding out the force. We came to a slow stop in the grass, rising slowly in the darkness. We were soaked through, and it was damn cold. But the blackness that was the chasm, along with the idea that we had almost fallen into it, chilled us further. "We're not going back that way," Fears whispered. "You're fucking throwing me before we do that shit again."
"Agreed," I breathed. I noticed that the pain had gone completely. We both stayed low to the ground, crawling most times, crouching others. We had to reach Alpha before the creature spotted us, which made this a game of stealth. Chapter 8 continued. Alira. Gone. At first she felt confusion, then anger, pain, but then it was followed by absolute cold. She was alone, again. She had known from the moment she'd awoken that he had gone. It was in his nature to go. As such, she wasn't really angry with him so much as upset by his absence. She cursed into a pillow, banging her fists into the plushy mattress, but found no solace. After a very brief consideration, she rose from the bed shivering, not from the cold of the room, but from an inner cold that spread through her in icy webs. His quarters had his feel about them. His martial style pervaded the design, and even his scent lingered with her proximity to his pillow. She dressed briskly, escaping from his room as quickly as possible. She closed his door behind her, hearing her heartbeat in her ears as she leaned against the door.
"It's never easy,"
Aline said, leaning on a wall beside Alira. Alira almost jumped, but controlled the urge as to not satisfy Aline.
"What?"
Alira breathed, almost completely out of breath.
"Love in times of war,"
Aline replied smoothly.
"Especially when we love the important ones, always having to sacrifice for the greater good, and following all those unsavory orders."
Aline shook her head, emphasizing the word unsavory.
"You told me to leave him alone. I listened for so long,"
Alira whispered, pain intruding on her voice.
"You should have listened longer,"
Aline fired back.
"This wouldn't have hurt nearly as bad."
"Wouldn't it?" Alira seemed to ask the ceiling.
"Seeing him head into your quarters every night. He needed someone," Aline responded coldly. "He always does." "Why not me?"
Alira asked exasperatedly.
"You already know the answer to that,"
Aline answered with finality. She breathed in and out slowly, down to the ground with her hands on her knees.
"You ordered him to go?"
Alira asked.
"I didn't stop him," Aline responded coldly as Alira gazed at her. You let him go? Alira asked, exasperated. Don't turn this on me, sweetheart. Aline almost cooed. He left of his own volition. I wouldn't order a suicide mission, but I wouldn't stop one if it's a damn good idea either. Alira remained silent in response. She knew it was Aline's job to protect Alira's emotion. She knew it wasn't Aline's job to protect her emotions. Her job was to win, preferably in a morally upstanding fashion, but to win nonetheless. Do you think he can beat it? Alira whispered, almost afraid of the answer. Yes, Aline declared, pushing off the wall, taking a few steps, and then turning to face Alira. Do I think it's probable? She hesitated. No, she finished before reaching out her right hand to Alira. Now come on, there's much to be done. Chapter 8 continued. Caden and Alira making deals. Caden, my boy, Alpha said in his characteristically fatherly voice. So nice of you to drop by. He smiled as his creatures threw Fears and me roughly to the ground in front of him. I picked myself off the ground, starting with a push-up onto my knees. Not exactly a polite welcome, I answered, brushing myself off, though it would do nothing against the mud. Well, he hesitated, stroking his bearded chin. One typically isn't overly polite to assassins. He growled the last word as I helped Fears to his feet. Get ready, I whispered to him softly before shouting back to Alpha. Assassin implies that I intended to kill you without your knowledge of my coming. Alpha cocked his head to the side in the barest indication of confusion. I see you didn't get my message, I replied calmly. Certified mail doesn't deliver so well when the bridge is out, Fears chimed in. Indeed, I responded, playing off of his statement. I had to use some rather unconventional methods instead. Oh, Alpha pondered. Haven't spoken with Bridget lately, then? No, Alpha answered, looking to the ground for a moment, though I suspect you'll have some interesting news for her soon. It's simple, I began. You think he'll try and make a deal? Alira asked as the women made their way to Bridget's quarters. I know it, Aline replied. What terms? Alira asked impatiently. You're not exactly in a position to negotiate, Alpha said slowly. Aren't I? I responded deftly. You don't want me dead. You're starting to catch on, Alpha growled as a smile played across his lips. You want me converted, I smiled back. I'm much more useful that way. Infinitely, Alpha confirmed. So what are you offering exactly? My imprisonment, I answered. You win, and I'll come with you willingly. And as a trade, you don't sack the castle. You accept their surrender. And if you win, Alpha asked. If you survive, then you leave. If you don't, your forces leave. I do love the idea of a fight, Alpha snarled. But... You don't think the wolf will accept terms? Alira asked as they rounded the last bend. Why? He never does, Aline responded, rapping on the door. Besides, she started, he already has what he wants. Caden? Alira responded with surety as Bridget finally opened the door. Well, I began, you're correct in thinking that I'd probably hesitate to take my own life, but I won't. Fears finished my statement, drawing his side knife and holding it across my throat. Agree, or you lose your prize, I choked out, feeling the blade tickle my skin. Clever trick, Alpha praised, dropping into a crouch and washing his hands in a small puddle. But you aren't the leverage I need, he chided, rising to his feet again before pointing past me to Fears. He is. So they're screwed, Bridget asked as Alira brought her up to speed on what had happened in reference to Fears and Caden. Not unless the wolf captures them, she answered calmly. Alira felt odd, wandering the halls with two other women, feeling a hole where Rain had been last time. Her panic for Caden's predicament quickly overpowered her guilt, though. And if he does? Bridget asked, following the other two women through the halls and up a flight of stairs towards the roof. It won't be over quickly for them, I can promise you that, Aline cut in. But he won't. Alira cut in a bit too urgently. Capture them, she said. He won't capture them, she repeated. Sir,
Fears shouted as he was shoved to the ground into the mud by a gang of corpses. His hands were tied behind his back, as were mine. "Yes, Corporal?" I gritted back, being forced to my knees next to him as he found his own. He leaned over and whispered in my ear. "I don't like your plan," he growled. "I thought I was fun," I commented in return. "What's wrong with my plan?" I hissed out. "Well, for starters," he stopped, coughing forcefully. "It fucking hurts," he finished, spitting into the mud as rain dripped from his face. "Usually does," I commented wryly, looking forward at Alpha. "Now what aren't I going to do with you boys?" he growled, flexing his right hand as he grew nightmarishly long claws. "Very little, I'm afraid," I answered as calmly as I could manage. "You know nothing of fear." "Yet," Alpha responded in a low, menacing tone. He was wrong. I was sure of it. He drew closer, grabbing my face and sinking his claws into my cheeks, drawing blood as he smiled. Well, I was almost sure of it.